Across there are a number of people who it's mostly green, leather.
Got you.
Step out on the platform as we can commence.
And I have actually taken seats. They can't see too well, but they will see what's going on. Well, everybody is very patient, in a nice frame of mind.
As a giant, music that we should always remember.
What we call item.
And of course I did get the license, but he didn't stay around too long. He travels all the time. Sometimes he's there, he's in Florida, he's in England.
And stand up.
Some brother wants to no, it's okay. We can.
We have some clearance of this area that we can.
Lord our God, that takes away the sin of we have trespassed against you, Lord, with us in our words or in our deeds, or in our thoughts, release license to serve us, remember, Lord, our brother, Johannes Lassie, our brothers and sisters, that have slept and resting in the water of faith, may their soul in the bosom of in the last from your from all prosperity, from all happiness, from all blessings, and from maintaining and meditation, gain that pure and repentance. Grant us from wisdom and power and skill and understanding and knowledge. The Prime Minister, Mr. Seaga, and member of the cabinet, of the government, official, we should at least say something to these beautiful people who are gathered here to pay their respect for our brother. A great prophet is kneeled by you now, and you have the opportunity to pray with him.
morning, ladies and gentlemen of the press. Time I simply said, well, any foreign journalists who are here who would wish to see me, I'd appreciate it if they could all do it at one time. So as on that basis, therefore, this arrangement was set up to you, but rather to give you the opportunity to ask questions on matters that you are here to cover. And I have to say particularly because it's the week before the presentation of Parliament first, and therefore I would not be in a position to speak too openly on many matters, say next week Friday this time. With those, I was very pleased with the way the event went. As you know, management of large crowds is not something that one can undertake with any great deal of confidence when it involves a very popular figure like Bob Marley was, or any folk hero. People get emotional and they tend to get out of hand. And I was very pleased with the very orderly conduct of the funeral service, and indeed of the service at the site of the mausoleum at Bob's birthplace in St. Anne, where on a tiny bit of land, thousands and thousands of people were there to witness that part of the service, and there wasn't a single incident of any unruliness or disorder. It was very orderly in its conduct, full of emotion and feeling, and of course, because Bob was a popular folk hero and singer, it had its element of music and song in it, which was a part of Bob's life. Yeah, you're touching on one of the principal themes that I hope to elaborate on in the presentation of the budget next week, so I can only reply to you in general terms. The fact of the matter is that it is well recognized that there is a substantial gap between development in the rural areas and in the urban areas. This has been traditionally so, and indeed is common to many countries, especially those that are at our stage of development, in which we have produced a modern urban industrial sector on the one hand, and a rural traditional agricultural sector on the other hand. These two sectors differ widely in the levels of development and in the extent to which standards of living have improved the lives of the people. Now, it is a cardinal feature of the policy of this government to try to close that gap. And to do this, we're embarking on a series program, which is an attempt to raise standards of living in the rural area so as to enable rural people to enjoy much the same quality of life that people in the urban area enjoy. This, we recognize, is not a project or a program that can be accomplished in any 5-year period. It is one that might take 10 or 15 years to do, because it is enormous. But previous governments have shied away from tackling that problem and problems of that type that take 5 or 10 or 15 years to do, because they think in terms of a 5-year period of a term of office. And what we have said is that regardless of the fact that a party is elected for a 5-year term of office, it must plan for the long-run development of the country, and successive governments must give cooperation and collaboration to such long-term plans so that it will be carried on by any governments that may succeed one which started it. In the plan, we are going to emphasize agriculture as the focal point, because agriculture is the economic base of the rural areas. Of course, we take into consideration the fact that the tourism sector is principally a rural area sector, and that the mining sector is principally a rural area sector. And these are tremendous economic stimulants to growth in the rural areas. And therefore, together with agriculture, will form a substantial economic base. But by far the greater number of people subsist from agriculture, and therefore we have to turn our specific attention and greater emphasis to agriculture and the improvement of agriculture if we are to reach roughly 50% of the population of the country who are involved in agriculture and various forms of agricultural life. So that the main emphasis will be on agriculture. Quite right to say the imports have helped considerably to break the back of black market prices. And this in turn has aided very substantially in breaking the back of inflation. It might interest you to know that inflation this year, as compared with last year and indeed with the series of years that preceded last year, going back to the middle of the 70s, when inflation ran in excess of 20% and as high as 50%, in the period November 1980 to April 1981, the rate of inflation has been 0. And to a large extent, this has been due to the fact that the imported foods have helped to break the back of the black market pricing and really reduce costs in basic food items. The problem that it causes in relation to the domestic suppliers of food is one that has to be tackled on a basis of fundamental restructuring of the agricultural sector. At the present time, there is no zoning of agriculture which endeavors to set aside or to utilize land that is best able to produce the particular crops for that particular crop only. Therefore, crops are being grown in a wild fashion all over the place, sometimes not in the best areas and therefore more expensively than they ought to be. Secondly, by virtue of the absence of zoning, there is no organized machinery for obtaining marketing information. The government hears of a surplus in onions or in carrots or in pork only when the onions and the carrots and the pork, which have been society, has substantial markets for exports, which we have not been able to fill. Coffee, cocoa, to name two, citrus, ginger, substantial local market for the production of copra, as well as in sugar and in bananas. And these are markets that we have not been able to fill, which we intend to move the agricultural sector more into those areas of development, those areas in which the prices they are concerned with are the prices for their export crops, so as to enable the import of cheap food to be of benefit to the consumer without hurting the farmer.
Mr. Prime Minister, we're hearing a lot in the news these days about infant formulas and breastfeeding. We understand Jamaica has one of the most successful public health programs advocating breastfeeding in the region, and that more than 20 countries are interested in learning about it and perhaps copying it. How is Jamaica responding to this interest?
We are in support of the resolution which was passed at the WHO conference this month, because we recognize that mother's milk is the formula that has the proper balance of nutrients for infants up to the age of 6 months old. Most formula milk is not cost efficient or efficient in terms of the composition that it offers to the infant child. Most of them have a ratio in excess of 10% of protein energy. Research has shown that a protein energy ratio in excess of 10% is inefficient because the infant cannot absorb that much protein. Hence, the product is more costly because of the excess protein. And in addition to being more costly, in Jamaica, there is a particular problem in that mothers who buy formula feed in tins, by virtue of the costly nature of the infant feed, do not tend to mix it according to the instructions on the label, but they dilute it so as to stretch it further. Hence, the child is deprived of proper nutrients in the early and formative period up to 6 months old. We are therefore in support of the resolution that has been passed, which will require legislation which will be protective of the way in which formula feed, infant feed, is promoted for sale, and the way in which it is advertised in terms of what it proposes and what it professes that it can do. Legislation, therefore, that will put infant feed in its proper perspective. Of the 13 makes of infant feed marketed in this country, only 4 fit within the formula for energy protein ratio of being 10 or less than 10%.
And what are you doing about these other countries that are interested in your program and learning more about it?
Well, we have had so much help from other countries that we'd be only too glad to be in a position to be able to help someone.
The United States has taken an unusual position of opposing this World Health Organization ban on the promotion of infant formulas. Your program, in fact, has enjoyed funding from the U.S. Agency for International Development. How would a cutoff of U.S. funds for that program affect it?
I don't anticipate any such cutoff.
So,
Mr. Prime Minister, do you plan to ask for that legislation here in Jamaica?
Yes. It's not a matter of asking, it's legislation that we propose to enact.
Sir, Michael Leaton of the London Times. You've just signed a deal with a loan agreement with the IMF. How does this, in your view, differ from the one which Jamaica failed to fulfill under the last administration? If you think the terms are easier and more fulfillable, in what way are they? You see? And why do you think that you've got a better deal this year?
That's it. Well, we certainly got a better deal. But we got a better deal because we fought for a better deal. And we fought for a better deal because we had the conditions to make that deal work. We have the confidence of the productive sector of the economy. We have the right climate for production. And we have the right ideological perspective that encourages production. Now, no matter what deal the previous administration got, if it did not have those ingredients, it could never have made it work. The previous administration lost the confidence of the productive sector, lost the confidence of the people in the country in the sense that they had no hope for the future and were not interested in looking downstream. They had cut off their thinking as to the future, and therefore no one was interested in producing. What we said to the IMF is, under the previous administration, the characteristic of the agreements were restrictions, belt tightening, various ways and means of constraining the economy so as to bend it into shape to fit the mold that that government thought the economy should be fitted into. We, on the other hand, have said that the people of Jamaica are not motivated by restrictions and constraints and appeals for belt tightening. They're motivated by initiative and enterprise. They're motivated by reward. And therefore what we want is an agreement which will emphasize the dynamic of reward and the motivation of reward and the elimination of restrictions, so that giving them their let, giving them the capabilities to be able to produce, which they are ready to do and have the confidence to do, and providing the foreign exchange for that purpose, growth will be restored. That is the kind of agreement that we got, and we didn't get it easily. It was a drawn-out discussion and battle with the fund because it is to a certain extent a departure from the normal type of agreements that are concluded by the fund, in which when a country gets into trouble, in the same way that a client gets into trouble with his banker, the first reaction is to impose restrictions on what he can do and what he cannot do. we said to the IMF that we wanted to emphasize the areas in which positive contributions can be made, and notwithstanding the fact that there are targets which we must meet, that there are performance criteria that we must live up to, all of which are still there as they were in the case of the previous government, we want to offer the people of Jamaica and the productive sector the opportunity to produce, using reward as the motivational force. That's the difference between the two agreements. Combination of, as I said before, we have a small security force. But the problem was that in the past, the last government deliberately allowed the security forces' capability to be run down. During 1980, election year, the military had a capability of only 25%. It did not have vehicles to transport members of the defense force. It did not have the wherewithal that was necessary for them to do the job that was required of them, particularly in that year, election year. The police force likewise was run down in its capabilities. Over 50% of police vehicles were laid up because of lack of spare parts. And the last government did not give them the necessary support in terms of funding to allow them to be at full capabilities to deal with the problems that would occur normally in an election year. In the forthcoming budget, it is our intention to substantially increase the funding of the security forces. And when I say substantially, I mean very substantially, to provide them with the equipment that they need to maintain law and order. And this equipment means putting the police force back on wheels, putting the defense force back to a level of capability on the basis of which it can cope with the problems that we face. Arming them in a fashion which will allow them not to be inferior to any other group. And in doing so, we recognize that we have to do this out of our own resources, because while assistance is available for all kinds of schemes and projects of a social and economic nature from a multitude of international agencies and governments, there are few sources from which one can obtain assistance.